Now then, the first time I came to Lord's was in 1924. That telegram I got from the Queen the other day set my mind thinking back to the old days. As a 10-year-old boy here in the summer of 1924, it's a summer I'll never forget. The previous winter, you see, I had scarlet fever. Had to spend time in an isolation hospital. I was given a copy of Wisdom to read, and, well, I was hooked on it. But I couldn't wait to escape, actually to watch some cricket. Now, there was a plan for the summer of 24 to send me to convalesce at the seaside, to Margate, to an aunt, my mother's sister. But Dad, well, he had other plans. I was to stay in London and do my lessons with him in the evening when he came home from work. So that was settled, and it meant, of course, that I had much of the days to myself. So, on Wednesday, the 7th of May, 1924, I came to Lord's for the first time. It was the opening day of the season. It started much later then. It was the first day of Middlesex v Hampshire, and I came in and sat on those seats at the other end of the ground. Only one tier of them then. G and H stands weren't built until a few years later, and Compton and Edrich, of course, hadn't even been thought about. At close of play, I came over to the Pavilion over here. Much activity there was. You see, it was MCC's AGM that day, the first Wednesday in May. Yes, I saw committee people. I saw Lord Hawke, the Earl of Dartmouth, the Duke of Rutland, and A.E.R. Gilligan, all fine men they were. I was sitting on a bench out the back here with my autograph book in my hand, waiting for the players to emerge. Now, I say players, the professional cricketers, you see. They weren't allowed in the pavilion, and they would come out via a funny little door over there by the cricket office. Anyway, after a while, I saw J.W. Hearn and Mead of Hampshire, so that was well worth the wait. I was too timid, though, to ask the amateurs, the gentlemen, for their signatures. You see, they were in the pavilion, but I did see Mr. Aird, the Hampshire amateur who became an assistant secretary of MCC in the 1920s and went on to become secretary of the club in 1953. He was talking to the Middlesex captain, F.T. Mann. They were talking about the anniversary dinner, which was to be held in the tavern that evening. Well, I was sitting on the bench, and a few moments later, an elderly gentleman came along and sat down next to me. Well, he looked interested in my book, and he seemed impressed, and he asked how old I was, and when I told him, he said, well, he said, how interesting. He said, I was only 10 when I first came here, and that was in 1840. 1840, good heavens. 50 years before this pavilion was even built. Lord's wasn't much more than a country meadow then. The seats didn't have backs, there was no proper scoreboard, but there was a tennis court over where the mound stand now is. He told me tales of the early Victorian times, back in 1840, when MCC had only 450 members. The elderly gentleman was here in 1850 for North v South. John Wisdom took all 10 wickets in an innings. In those days, he said, the ground had slightly developed. It was enclosed by a circle of tents and stalls which were selling shellfish and fruit and so on. And he told me that one afternoon a ball was hit into the crowd with such force that it fixed itself onto the point of a knife which was in the hands of a woman who was about to open an oyster. Well, fancy that. The elderly gentleman told me that by 1870 the place was getting pretty full on major match days. 30,000 came along to watch Eton play Harrow that year, and on he went. Past the first test match in 1884, into the new century and up to the German war. He had seen George Parr hit a ball over the tennis court, and he'd seen Albert Trott hit one over this pavilion. Albert Trott was an Australian who was on the MCC ground staff in the 1890s. Now, not selected to tour England with Australia in 1896, he paid his own passage over here and he joined Middlesex instead. It was Monty Noble, M.A. Noble, whom he hit over the pavilion, playing for MCC, funnily enough, against the Australians in 1899. And my elderly companion was actually here and he saw that happen. Never has it happened since. Poor Albert Trott. He was a first-class umpire for a couple of years before shooting himself dead just before the start of the First World War. The elderly gentleman was also a friend of F.A. Tarrant, another Middlesex cricketer. Now, he was an Australian too, but not selected to play test matches either, because he lived in England, and that wasn't done in those days, if you wanted to play for Australia. Some said he was the best of his generation. Well, he hit 3 double centuries for Middlesex, and in all first-class cricket, he took 9 wickets in an innings on 7 occasions. And just after the end of the Great War, whilst he was in India, playing for the Maharaja of Cooch Bihar's 11 against Lord Willingdon's team at Pune, he took all 10 wickets in an innings, and he scored 182 not out in the same match, a first-class match. My word, what a cricketer he must have been. Talking of Aussies, the old man was here for the 1920 Test match between England and Australia. That was probably the strongest side they had ever sent to these shores. We were well beaten. Hobbs was injured, and those 21 Australians were probably the best side which had ever come here. Poor old Frank Woolley. He was out twice in the 90s in that match, both times dismissed by Maley. The old gentleman looked at me and said, "Boy, this is a special place and don't forget it. And if you live as long as I have, you will see many changes." And with that, off he went to the anniversary dinner puffing on his pipe. Well, many years have since passed and I never saw him again, but now I understand what he meant, because I now have lived as long as he did. But what have I seen for myself? Well, only a couple of weeks after that Hampshire match in May 1924, I came back to watch MCC play Cambridge University. Dulip Singhji scored 120 and put on a fine partnership with Patsy Hendren. What a joy it was to watch them bat together. And the following month we had Eton versus Harrow, and I saw a dashing young batsman, Lord Hyde of Eton, who scored 86 in that match. Poor fellow was killed in a shooting accident while still in his 20s. And at the end of the season I came back in September and watched some Cross Arrows matches. Now, I was back at school by then, you see, so I could only come after tea, but my word, it was well worth the visit. I have such happy memories of 1924. I kept coming. 2 years later, MCC knocked down the old grandstand and built another one. It was for the wealthy people, to be honest. Well, the upper sections and the balcony were. You see, the fact of the matter is you couldn't see anything at all from underneath the balcony. When the MCC committee went to inspect the stand, they were so upset by it that they gave Herbert Baker a terrible telling off. And he decided, by way of some form of compensation, I suppose, to give the club a weather vane. And it was called Father Time. In those days, you could also hire cushions. Now, that continued until the 1980s. I often hired a cushion because I loved sitting on the grass, you see. Anyway, sometime in the early 1980s, play was abandoned unexpectedly early for the day, and spectators were so upset they all chucked their cushions onto the outfield before they left for the evening, and it took the groundsman nearly 2.5 hours to clear up the mess. Yes, not long afterwards the MCC committee made a statement saying that the services of the British Cushion Supply Company Limited would no longer be needed at Lord's. I was sitting on one of their cushions in 1931, you know, watching MCC play the New Zealanders. Now, all the newspapers said the New Zealanders were a weak side, but they beat MCC by an innings and 120 runs. They had a chap called W.E. Merritt, and he was a leg spinner. He took 99 wickets on that tour, including 7 for 28 in the second innings of that match. And that was also the game when R.O. Talbot, a hard-hitting middle-order batsman for New Zealand, nearly emulated Albert Trott's feat from 99, but his towering drive hit the very upper section of the top balcony of the Pavilion and bounced back and landed on the concourse. Another couple of inches and it would have gone over the top. You know, he broke his bat playing that shot. I remember coming after the Second World War, you know. The 1948 Australians, what a side they were. My word, I'd seen Bradman play many times, of course. He scored 89 in the second innings of that match, which happened to be his average on the tour, in fact. Crowds were massive in those days. 6 or 7 deep they would be, standing at the back of Compton and Edrich, as it now is, at the nursery end. And 6 or 7 deep they would be sitting on the grass. And for county matches too. Middlesex v Sussex at Whitsun. Quite often, you know, the gates would be closed half an hour before the start of play. But then, in the 1950s, things started to change slowly. A lot of people had bought motor cars and television sets, and they weren't coming to cricket quite so often. Something had to be done. Well, the MCC committee had a brainwave, and they invented one-day cricket. Now, that started in 1963 with the Gillette Cup, which then was 65 overs per side. Now, that got the crowds back, and by the end of the decade, we had another one-day competition on a Sunday afternoon, and the club had built a new tavern and a brand new stand, the tavern stand, a magnificent stand to match it, and by then, of course, the Warner stand had been built, so the place was very slowly changing. Mind you, I was still sitting on the grass, quite happily, thank you. In those days, if you wanted to sit in the grand stand, you had to buy a ticket from a man who sat in a dark cage at the foot of a staircase underneath the balcony next to the printing office. Quite often he was asleep by lunchtime. You know, the West Indians sent some very strong sides over here after the Second War. In the 1950s we had the 3 Ws and Ramadin and Valentine. And then in the 60s, Sobers, Hall and Griffith and Nurse and Gibbs. And then in the 70s, Vivian Richards and Haynes and as many fast bowlers as you can think of. I was sitting on the grass, you know, in 1975 when I saw Clive Lloyd hold aloft the World Cup. It had been given to him by Prince Philip, who was president of MCC. And I can recall the final day of the test match here in 1984. Yes, England set West Indies 344 to win, and they got there, losing only 1 wicket, scoring at 90 an hour, and Gordon Greenidge carted us all over Lord's. 214 not out he scored. What an innings that was. I also remember the test match in 1969, you know, sitting on the grass just in front of the mound stand with Basil d'Oliveira fielding only a few yards in front of me. Well, he was so close, and it was about 12:30, I thought I'd offer him a sandwich, a cheese one. Well, he took it and he ate it. Seemed as if he enjoyed it too, for that matter. It was so intimate sitting on the grass. And how happy I was to come back 45 years later for MCC v Hertfordshire this June, and I could sit on the grass once again. You know, I was the oldest person there by a long chalk, but I was the happiest by an even longer one. I think that calls for another drink.